I hadn't planned on writing to her. It just got unbearably quiet one night. Silence is the loudest thing in the world when it echoes with your own heartbeat. I was sitting by the window in my Portland apartment, watching the rain draw transparent trails down the glass. The drops fell as if time itself were mourning what we'd lost. On the table lay an old envelope, crumpled and yellowed with age. I'd found it by accident in a box of memories. Her old address, Emily Carter, 12th Pine Street, Riverside, Maine. I smiled, though something tightened in my chest. Once, Emily and I dreamed that life would be simple. Love, travel, a small apartment by the sea. But then we each went our separate ways, and that simplicity faded, like warm breath on cold glass. I was 32, and I felt like I'd lost myself somewhere along the way. My coworkers were getting married, friends talked about their kids, and I drank my morning coffee alone, as if punishing myself for something I couldn't even remember. And then, between sips of bitter coffee, I began to write. Emily, I don't know if you still live there. Maybe this letter will never reach you, but I just wanted to remember how we ran through the summer rain, laughing, not caring who saw us. I just need to feel that the guy I used to be still exists somewhere. I signed it simply, Ryan, and I dropped the letter into the mailbox like a stone into a river, not expecting it to ever float back. I thought that would be the end of it, but a few days later, my hand reached for the pen again, and then again. With every letter, I opened another part of myself, how I sometimes talked to the empty chair across the table, how I learned to cook spaghetti because someone has to, how I meet women on the subway with the same chestnut hair, but I look away because I don't want to see an almost you. Those letters became my breath. I didn't know if anyone ever read them, but they healed me. Meanwhile, in the house on Pine Street where Emily once lived, another woman had long since moved in, Margaret Lewis. She was a music teacher, a little sad, a little strong, with warm eyes and a Labrador named Simon. One morning, she opened the mailbox and, among the bills, saw a white envelope written in a hand that carried a quiet sincerity. She read the first few lines and froze. I think I still remember how your hair smelled after the rain. Something inside her ached, softly, sweetly. There was something real in those words, not just memories, but a bare beating heart. Simon, she whispered to the dog, watching her with those wise eyes, I think this letter isn't meant for me, but I can guess who was supposed to read it. A week later, another one arrived, then another, and every time Margaret opened an envelope, she felt that somewhere, far away, someone was saying the very thing she herself was afraid to admit. I'm lonely, but I still want to believe in love. One rainy night, as streaks of silver and shadow ran down the window pane, she picked up a pen and wrote back. Ryan, I didn't think you still remembered. Maybe we both tried to forget, but the heart keeps what it wants to keep. I don't know why you're writing, but when I read your words, something in me comes alive again. She signed it Emily. And before she dropped the letter into the mailbox, she stood by the door for a long time, as if asking herself for permission. I got her reply 3 days later. When I saw the familiar handwriting, my heart started pounding, like I was 17 again. I tore the envelope open and couldn't believe my eyes. It was her words, warm, alive, real. I once went back to our tree by the river too. Our initials are still there, under the bark. The tree's grown bigger. Maybe we have too. It was hard to breathe. I read that letter over and over, dozens of times, and every sentence sent a current through my fingertips. I couldn't sit still. A day later, I was on my way to Riverside. Autumn outside the window looked like a memory. Warm, a little faded, but still beautiful. And when the bus turned onto Pine Street, I saw the house my heart still remembered. I walked up to the door and pressed the bell. My heart fluttered like a bird's wings. The door opened, and I froze. Standing before me wasn't Emily. It was another woman, a little older, with a gentle face, gray eyes, and a quiet sadness behind them. "You, Ryan, right?" Her voice trembled. I just nodded. "My name's Margaret," she said softly. "And I need to tell you the truth." The world seemed to stop. "It was me who wrote to you," she whispered. I couldn't help it. I'm sorry. I read your letters, and there was something alive in them, something I'd been missing for a long time." I stood there in silence. I wanted to be angry, but I couldn't. There was such honesty in her voice that even my pain went quiet. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I never meant to lie. It's just, your words, they touched my heart." I looked at her, and suddenly I understood. This wasn't about deception. It was about two lonely souls who had accidentally found each other. "Maybe," I said quietly, "I wasn't writing to her all this time. Maybe I was just looking for someone who would read." She smiled, barely, gently. Simon brushed his nose against my hand. We sat down on the porch. The city smelled of evening rain, and when she poured the tea, for the first time in years, it felt like the world was breathing again. The silence between us no longer hurt. It sounded like music. I asked if I could stay the night, but that night I couldn't fall asleep for a long time. In the window, the moon's reflection swayed softly, and in my mind, her words kept echoing. "I never meant to lie. It's just that your letters touched my heart." I replayed that moment over and over, the way she stood in front of me, in a simple gray shirt, with eyes that hid something familiar, as if I'd seen those eyes before, in someone else, in another life. And maybe I had, in my own reflection, when I wrote to her. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee. Margaret was in the kitchen, wearing a big sweater, her hair tied loosely in a bun. Simon slept by her feet, and outside, the rain was falling quietly. "How did you sleep?" she asked with a smile. "Like I was 17, I said. "And for the first time in a long while, I feel like I want to stay, at least for a little while longer." She set a cup in front of me. "No sugar, right?" I raised an eyebrow. "You remembered that from the letters." "I have a good memory," she said, looking away. At first, we talked about little things, about the rain, about music, about books. But every word felt like a step closer, like a careful touch between two souls. When she laughed, fine lines formed at the corners of her eyes, and I wanted to remember that laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was honest, like a song you recognize even after years of silence. "You know," she said, pouring herself some tea, "I used to write letters too, only no one ever read them. I wrote to myself, so I wouldn't forget what my own voice sounded like. I stayed silent because I understood, and because maybe we had been writing to each other all along, without knowing it. We started seeing each other every day. I stayed in Riverside longer than I'd planned, and each day added something new to our quiet conversations. We walked along the riverside, where I had once held another girl's hand. Now I walked beside Margaret, and for the first time, I felt an unfamiliar kind of peace. "Do you regret answering me?" she asked one evening. "No," I said. "If it weren't for you, I'd still be writing into nowhere." She smiled, but there was something in her eyes I couldn't quite read, as if she were hiding a story larger than the one she was ready to tell. We sat by the river. The water moved slowly, like thoughts that refused to leave. I remembered the old tree with our carved initials, and I took her there. We walked in silence. Only the wind brushed the branches, and the scent of pine was just as it had been back then. When we reached it, the bark still held those carved letters, R plus E. They had darkened with time, but they hadn't disappeared. "Strange," I whispered. "I thought it would have faded by now." Margaret touched the tree with her fingertips. "Love doesn't fade, Ryan," she said softly. "It just changes." Her words cut straight through me. She wasn't speaking about Emily, and not about herself. She was speaking about something that belonged to both of us, about the silence we had both learned how to listen to. That evening, we went back to her house. I stayed for dinner. She played the piano, an old, slightly out-of-tune one, but every chord sounded soft, like a breath. "Is that Chopin?" I asked. "No," she said quietly. "It's me. I think every woman has her own melody. Not all of us remember it." I sat beside her. Our shoulders touched, and in that moment I realized something inside me was changing. Not suddenly, not sharply, but gently, like spring coming after a long winter. She looked at me, and there was a question in her eyes. I didn't answer with words. I simply took her hand. She didn't pull away. The next morning I woke up on the couch. Simon was asleep beside me, and on the table lay a note. "Went to school. There's apple pie in the fridge, the one you wrote about. M." I smiled, and for the first time in years, life tasted a little like childhood again. The days grew warmer, and we grew closer. I helped her in the garden, she taught me to play the piano, and laughed whenever I hit the wrong notes. Sometimes we sat in silence for hours, just next to each other, while Simon chased the falling leaves. I didn't know what it was, friendship, compassion, or something more. But something was growing inside me, something I thought I'd lost forever. One evening she said, "Ryan, what if I told you I was scared too? That every day I was afraid to open the mailbox, and at the same time I couldn't wait for your letter to be there." I looked at her, and suddenly I understood what truth looks like. It hurts a little, it tickles a little, but it warms you all the way to your heart. I stepped closer to her. She didn't move away, and then I whispered, "Maybe those letters really did find the person they were meant for." She touched my face, and her fingers were warm, like light after a long darkness. Outside it was raining again, only this time I didn't feel alone, because beside me sat the woman who once opened a stranger's letter and by accident opened my heart. In autumn, Riverside smelled of apples, damp air, and the warmth of other people's fireplaces. I had been living in her house for 3 weeks. Not forever, I told myself, it was temporary. But little by little, my things began to migrate from the suitcase to the shelves. My razor found its place beside her toothbrush. Even Simon started sleeping by my bed. We had become something like a couple, though neither of us ever said the word aloud. We just were. We cooked dinner together, were silent together, shared the same quiet, and that silence didn't suffocate. It breathed. Yet in every glance of hers I could feel there was something unspoken, like a stone at the bottom of a river, unseen but shaping the whole current around it. One morning, I woke up early. There was a letter in the mailbox, my handwriting on the front, an old envelope, the return address, Pine Street, and a red stamp, "Return to sender." It was one of the first I'd ever sent. It had come back, like a memory that refuses to fade. I held it in my hands, and it became hard to breathe. Everything I'd tried to leave behind was knocking at the door again. We didn't suddenly become a happy couple. Everything was real, awkward, uncertain, full of silences where words sometimes got lost, but we were learning not to be afraid of closeness. Learning to talk, not about the past, but about the now. Sometimes I saw Margaret looking out the window toward the place where the post office used to be, and I realized we're all a little like her. We're all waiting for a letter that might change something inside us. One day, while cleaning out a drawer, I found a blank envelope and an empty sheet of paper. I looked at it for a long while, then picked up a pen and wrote, "Margaret, thank you for opening my letter, and for opening me too." I slipped the page into the envelope and left it on her piano. When she read it, she simply came over and leaned against me. No words, no explanations, and that was a real yes. Not loud, not romantic, but true. I don't write letters to nowhere anymore, because now, when I want to tell someone something, I just turn my head and she's there. And sometimes when it rains outside, she takes my hand and says, "Shh, listen, the past is speaking." And we listen, not to remember, but to stop being afraid of what comes next.